February 7th, 1926. A small crowd gathers outside the Scopes mansion in Dayton, Tennessee. The air still thick with the summer heat that had baked this town during what newspapers called the trial of the century just 7 months earlier. William Jennings Bryan, the great commoner, the three-time presidential candidate, the voice of America's rural heartland, had died here. Died defending God in a courtroom. Died a laughingstock to much of the nation. And on this cold February morning, as they prepared to move his body for burial, something irreversible had already begun. A crack in the foundation of American Christianity that would widen into a chasm. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. The Scopes trial wasn't really about evolution. It wasn't even really about science versus religion. It was about something far more profound, far more devastating. It was the day that America's cultural elite looked at the Christianity of the heartland and decided it was backward, ignorant, and unfit for the modern world. And the heartland felt it, felt the contempt, felt the mockery, and began a retreat that would reshape American religion for the next century. Let me take you back to understand what was really lost in that Tennessee courtroom, because the story you think you know is probably wrong. In 1925, America was splitting in two. Not north and south this time. Not even really urban versus rural, though that was part of it. The split was epistemological. It was about how you know what's true. On one side stood the modernists, children of the Enlightenment, believers in progress, science, and the power of human reason to solve every problem. On the other side stood what they called the fundamentalists, though that word didn't mean then what it means now. These were ordinary Christians, mainstream believers who had dominated American culture for generations, who suddenly found themselves being treated like relics of a superstitious past. The man at the center of our story, William Jennings Bryan, was 65 years old in 1925. 3 times he'd run for president. 3 times he'd lost. But he'd never lost the love of common Americans, particularly in the South and Midwest. Bryan wasn't some backwoods preacher. He'd been Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. He'd championed women's suffrage, progressive taxation, and the direct election of senators. He'd fought against imperialism and corporate monopolies. In his day, Bryan was a progressive. But there was one thing he would not compromise on: the Bible. Not because he was ignorant of science, but because he'd seen what happened in Europe. Here's what most people miss. Bryan had watched Germany. He'd studied how German universities in the late 1800s had embraced Darwinian evolution, not just as biology, but as philosophy. Social Darwinism. The survival of the fittest applied to human society. The idea that some races were more evolved than others. He'd watched this thinking lead directly to German militarism in World War I. He'd lost friends in that war. And when he returned to America and saw the same ideas taking root in American universities, the same casual dismissal of human equality in favor of evolutionary hierarchy, he became terrified. Not of evolution as biology, but of evolution as a weapon to justify the strong dominating the weak. So when Tennessee passed the Butler Act in March 1925, making it illegal to teach human evolution in public schools, Bryan saw it as a defense of human dignity. The ACLU saw it as an opportunity to challenge the law. They placed newspaper advertisements looking for a teacher willing to be prosecuted. And in Dayton, Tennessee, a group of businessmen saw it as something else entirely: a chance to put their town on the map. John Scopes was 24 years old. He taught physics and coached football. He wasn't even the regular biology teacher, but he agreed to be arrested, partly to help out, partly because he wasn't sure he believed the law was right. On May 5th, he was formally charged. The trial was set for July, and then something remarkable happened. Clarence Darrow, the most famous lawyer in America, defender of Leopold and Loeb, champion of unpopular causes, volunteered to defend Scopes for free. And Bryan, who hadn't practiced law in decades, volunteered to join the prosecution. What happened next was the first media circus of the modern age. Over 200 journalists descended on Dayton, population 1,800. Western Union installed telegraph lines. Chicago's WGN radio broadcast the trial live to millions. the first trial ever broadcast nationwide. H.L. Mencken, perhaps the most influential journalist in America, came from Baltimore to cover it for the Sun papers, and Mencken loathed Bryan, loathed everything he represented. The trial began on July 10th, 1925. The temperature inside the courthouse topped 100 degrees. Judge John Ralston, a local man who opened each day with prayer, made an early crucial decision. The trial would not be about whether evolution was true. It would only be about whether Scopes had broken the law. This seemed simple enough, but Darrow had other plans. For days, the trial droned through technicalities. Did Scopes actually teach evolution? The evidence said yes, he'd used the state-approved textbook that included it. Case closed. But Darrow kept trying to put evolution itself on trial to call expert witnesses on science. The judge wouldn't allow it. The jury wouldn't hear about biology. And then, on the 7th day of the trial, Darrow did something unprecedented. He called William Jennings Bryan to the stand as an expert on the Bible. Bryan should have refused. His fellow prosecutors begged him not to do it. But Bryan's fatal flaw was his confidence in his own righteousness. He believed he could defend the Bible against any attack. He took the stand. What happened next is seared into American cultural memory, though most people remember a version twisted by the 1960 play and film Inherit the Wind, which fictionalized the trial into a morality play about science triumphing over ignorance. The real exchange was more complex and more tragic. Darrow questioned Bryan about biblical literalism. Did he believe in the literal six-day creation? Did he believe the earth was created in 4004 BC, as Bishop Ussher had calculated? Did he believe Jonah was literally swallowed by a whale? That Joshua made the sun stand still? Bryan, exhausted by the heat and the week-long trial, defended a literal reading of Genesis. But he also conceded that the days of creation might have been longer periods. He acknowledged that he didn't know everything, that some things required faith. And Darrow pounced on every uncertainty, every admission of not knowing, making it sound like ignorance rather than humility. The courtroom audience, mostly local sympathizers, turned hostile toward Darrow. The judge finally ended the interrogation. The next day, he struck the entire testimony from the record. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. Not in the courtroom, where the jury took 9 minutes to find Scopes guilty and fine him $100. The damage was done in the newspapers. H.L. Mencken's dispatches from Dayton dripped with contempt. He called it the monkey trial. He described the locals as morons and yokels and peasants. He painted Bryan as a sweating, bumbling fool, a has-been politician clinging to primitive superstition. And Mencken's words were reprinted in newspapers across America. Urban America read them and laughed. The South and rural Midwest read them and felt humiliated, betrayed, mocked. 5 days after the trial ended, William Jennings Bryan died in Dayton. The official cause was apoplexy, perhaps a cerebral hemorrhage. But many said he died of a broken heart. He'd won the trial but lost the war of public opinion. He'd defended his faith and become a national joke. Now, here's where it gets interesting and where we need to talk about what really happened in the years that followed, because this is where the title of this video starts to make sense. Before I continue, let me ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this from? And what's your profession? Are you a teacher, a student, someone fascinated by how history shapes our present? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious about who's drawn to these stories. And if you're finding value in what we do here at Professor Archive, exploring the forgotten corners of history that explain our world today, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps us keep digging into these stories that mainstream education often overlooks. After the Scopes trial, something profound happened to American Christianity, particularly in the South and Midwest. The fundamentalists, as they were now universally called, didn't disappear. They withdrew. They'd been publicly humiliated by the coastal elites, by the newspapers, by the radio broadcasts. They'd been told their faith was incompatible with modern knowledge, that they had to choose between the Bible and science, between God and progress, and many of them chose differently than the modernists expected. They chose to separate. Throughout the late 1920s and 1930s, conservative Christians began building a parallel infrastructure. Fundamentalist churches split from mainline denominations. Bible colleges sprang up, separate from the liberal universities that were supposedly corrupting the youth. Radio programs, independent of the mainstream networks that had mocked them, began broadcasting Sunday sermons. Publishing houses printed religious literature untainted by modernist theology. It was a wholesale retreat from the American mainstream. But here's what's crucial. This wasn't the plan. Before the Scopes trial, conservative evangelical Christianity wasn't a subculture. It was the culture in much of America. The great revivals of the 19th century, the Second Great Awakening, had made evangelical Protestantism the default setting of American life. These believers had founded universities, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, all started as Christian institutions. They'd led the abolition movement. They'd championed social reforms. They weren't hiding in bunkers, they were running the show. The Scopes trial changed the equation. It sent a message. Your faith is backwards. Your beliefs are embarrassing. Educated, modern people don't think this way anymore, and much of America's heartland heard that message and pulled back. Stopped engaging with mainstream culture, stopped trusting mainstream institutions, started building their own separate world. The statistics tell the story. In 1925, the major mainline Protestant denominations, the Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Congregationalists, dominated American religious life with over 40 million members. These were the churches that increasingly accommodated modernist theology, that made peace with evolution, that softened the harder edges of traditional doctrine. They were the respectable churches, the ones you joined to fit in with polite society. By 2020, those same denominations had shrunk to under 13 million members in a country with twice the population. They'd collapsed. Meanwhile, the conservative churches that embraced fundamentalism, or its softer cousin evangelicalism, exploded in growth but remained largely separate from mainstream American culture until much later. Southern Baptists went from 3.2 million members in 1925 to over 14 million by 2000. Pentecostal denominations that barely existed in 1925 grew to tens of millions. But these believers, scarred by the mockery of the Scopes era, largely avoided the universities, the arts, the intellectual centers of national life. Think about what was lost in this great divorce. Before the Scopes trial, there was a robust tradition of Christians engaging deeply with science, with philosophy, with the intellectual currents of their day. Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics, was an Augustinian friar. Georges Lemaitre, who proposed the Big Bang Theory, was a Catholic priest. Francis Collins, who led the Human Genome Project, is an evangelical Christian. But after Scopes, the perception became fixed. Serious Christians don't do serious science. Serious scientists don't take Christianity seriously. Both sides retreated to their corners. The cultural impact was staggering. By the 1930s and 40s, when you looked at the novels being written, the plays being performed, the films being made in Hollywood, the conversations happening at Harvard and Yale and Princeton, conservative Christianity had virtually no voice. It wasn't represented. It wasn't part of the conversation. The fundamentalists had their own subculture, their own books and radio programs, and eventually their own schools. But they'd ceded the commanding heights of American culture to the modernists. And here's the twist. Both sides suffered for it. The mainline churches that accommodated modernity, that watered down the supernatural elements, that turned Jesus into a moral teacher rather than a divine savior, they hemorrhaged members over the following decades. Turns out people don't get up early on Sunday morning for mild ethical suggestions. They want something transcendent, something that demands everything. When Christianity became nothing more than niceness, nothing more than social justice plus hymns, it lost its power to transform lives. By the 1960s, the mainline was in freefall, hemorrhaging the children and grandchildren of those who'd mocked Bryan. Meanwhile, the separatist fundamentalists, cut off from the broader intellectual tradition, sometimes calcified into anti-intellectualism. Not always. There were thoughtful fundamentalists, scholars who maintained rigorous thinking within a conservative framework. But the overall trajectory bent toward suspicion of education, toward a bunker mentality that saw every cultural change as an attack, every new idea as a threat. The confident, engaged Christianity of the 19th century, the kind that had built hospitals and universities and led reform movements, was replaced by a defensive, reactionary Christianity that saw the modern world as enemy territory. But let's dig deeper into what was actually lost, because this is where it gets personal, where it stops being about denominations and starts being about people. Sarah Comstock was 23 in 1925. She taught in a one-room schoolhouse in rural Tennessee, about 50 miles from Dayton. She'd grown up in a devout Methodist family, attended a women's college, and dreamed of becoming a doctor. After the Scopes trial, after reading Mencken's articles that painted anyone who believed the Bible as an uneducated rube, she changed her plans. She'd face enough opposition as a woman in medicine. She couldn't bear to also be dismissed as a religious primitive. She became a nurse instead. We know this because she wrote about it in her diary, now held in the Tennessee State Library. "I cannot be both a believer and a scholar," she wrote in August 1925. "The world has made me choose." How many Sarah Comstocks were there? How many bright young believers from the Heartland looked at the mockery of Bryan, at the sneering dismissal of their faith, and concluded they had to choose between their intellect and their Christianity? How many chose to hide their faith to pursue their dreams? How many chose to abandon their dreams to keep their faith? We can't count them, but we can see the effect in the statistics. Between 1920 and 1940, the percentage of students from rural and southern backgrounds at elite universities dropped precipitously, even as those universities expanded. The brain drain from the Heartland accelerated, but it wasn't just economic, it was cultural. Ambitious young believers increasingly felt they had to choose: stay home and stay Christian, or go to the big city and leave your faith at the door. The loss wasn't just individual, it was institutional. Princeton Theological Seminary, founded in 1812 as a bastion of conservative Reformed theology, underwent a bitter split in 1929 when J. Gresham Machen and other conservatives left to found Westminster Theological Seminary. They couldn't coexist within the same institution anymore. The University of Chicago Divinity School, once broadly evangelical, became a center of liberal Protestantism and biblical criticism. Wheaton College, west of Chicago, was founded in 1860 but explicitly positioned itself as a fundamentalist alternative after the Scopes trial. Before Scopes, devout Christians and modernists could debate within the same institutions. After Scopes, they increasingly couldn't even occupy the same buildings. This geographical and cultural segregation had political consequences that echo to our present day. Before the Scopes trial, the Democratic Party was the party of Bryan, of Southern and Midwestern populism, of conservative Christianity combined with economic progressivism. Bryan railed against the gold standard in Wall Street while defending the Bible. That coalition became impossible to maintain. By the 1930s, the Democrats were becoming the party of the urban North, of secular progressivism, of the New Deal elites. Conservative Christians in the South stayed Democratic for decades out of Civil War loyalty, but the cultural alienation was already beginning. The religious realignment that would culminate in the 1970s and 80s when the South turned Republican and evangelicals became a core GOP constituency started at the Scopes trial. It was the day the Democratic Party of Bryan began dying. And the Republicans? They'd been the party of northern business, of urban elites, of temperance reformers and anti-slavery crusaders. They weren't particularly religious in the evangelical sense. William Howard Taft, Republican president, was a Unitarian. Herbert Hoover was a Quaker. But over the following decades, as the cultural divorce deepened, the Republicans found themselves becoming the default home for conservative Christians who felt homeless in the increasingly secular Democratic coalition. Neither party wanted this initially. Both were uncomfortable with it. but the logic of post-Scopes cultural segregation pushed them together. Let's be clear about something. The Scopes trial didn't create these tensions. They were already there, bubbling under the surface. The conflict between traditional Christianity and modernist thought, between rural and urban values, between different visions of American identity, these had been building for decades. The Scopes trial was the flashpoint, the moment when private discomfort became public rupture, when disagreement became divorce. But here's what makes it tragic. It didn't have to happen this way. Look at how other countries navigated the same tensions. Britain had its own controversies over Darwin, its own debates between science and religion, but British Christianity never experienced the same wholesale cultural retreat. Why? Partly because British Christians weren't publicly humiliated on a national stage. There was no British equivalent of Bryan being cross-examined about Jonah and the whale, no British Mencken mocking believers as morons in every major newspaper. The conflict remained primarily academic, fought in journals and lecture halls, not sensationalized in a trial broadcast to millions. Germany had its liberals and conservatives, its modernists and traditionalists. But World War II forced a different kind of reckoning. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian executed by the Nazis for his resistance work, represented a Christianity that was both intellectually sophisticated and deeply orthodox. He engaged with modern philosophy while maintaining traditional faith. He didn't retreat from culture, he confronted it, even unto death. The horrors of Nazism discredited the idea that modern educated Europeans were naturally more enlightened than religious primitives. If the most educated, scientifically advanced nation on earth could produce Auschwitz, maybe the conflict wasn't really between ignorance and knowledge. American Christianity, having already retreated after Scopes, mostly missed that lesson. By the time World War II ended, the cultural divorce was complete. Elite universities were secular, conservative Christianity was suburban and eventually exurban, and they'd stopped talking to each other in any meaningful way. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s briefly disrupted this pattern. Here was a movement led largely by black Protestant ministers, deeply rooted in Christianity, quoting the Bible and singing hymns, demanding justice. Martin Luther King Jr. represented a Christianity that was both conservative in its theology and progressive in its politics, that engaged with modern philosophy while preaching old-time religion. For a moment, it seemed possible that the post-Scopes divorce might be reversed, that Christianity could reclaim its prophetic voice in American culture without being dismissed as backward. But that moment passed. King was assassinated, the movement fragmented, and by the 1970s, white evangelical Christianity had largely retreated again, this time into the suburbs and the Sun Belt, into megachurches and Christian schools, and it's an explicitly conservative politics that defined itself in opposition to the cultural revolution of the 60s. The moral majority of the 1980s, the Christian coalition of the 1990s, these were attempts to re-engage with American culture, but on explicitly oppositional terms. They weren't trying to join the conversation, they were trying to win a culture war. And culture wars, by definition, assume irreconcilable differences. Where does this leave us? In 2024, America is still living with the consequences of that July day in 1925, when Clarence Darrow questioned William Jennings Bryan. We're still divided along the fault lines that opened then. Elite universities are still largely secular, often hostile to conservative Christianity. Evangelical churches are still largely separate from mainstream intellectual life. Both sides still mostly talk past each other, assuming bad faith, unable to imagine that intelligent, informed people could sincerely disagree about fundamental things. The statistics are stark. According to Pew Research, 63% of Americans with postgraduate degrees say they believe in God with absolute certainty, compared to 73% of those with only a high school education. The gap widens for specific Christian beliefs. Only 25% of postgraduate degree holders believe the Bible is literally true, compared to 42% of high school graduates. Education correlates with secularization in America in a way it doesn't in many other countries. Why? Because we never healed from the Scopes trial. We institutionalized the idea that smart people don't really believe this stuff, that faith is for the simple-minded and education is for sophisticates. Both sides pay a price. Secular academia has become increasingly disconnected from the lived experience of millions of Americans, unable to understand the motivations and worldviews of nearly half the country. This has obvious political consequences. The repeated surprise of coastal elites when religious conservatives show up to vote, but also intellectual ones. Questions about meaning, purpose, morality, the things that actually motivate most human beings, get short shrift in universities where discussing God is vaguely embarrassing. And conservative Christianity? It's produced some brilliant scholars and thinkers, but they still operate largely within their own ecosystem. Francis Collins directed the National Institutes of Health, but he's an exception. Most evangelical intellectuals teach at evangelical colleges, write for evangelical publishers, speak at evangelical conferences. The segregation continues. Young believers still often feel they have to choose between their faith and full participation in elite culture. Here's what haunts me about the Scopes trial. Bryan wasn't entirely wrong. His fears about social Darwinism weren't paranoid. The eugenics movement of the 1920s and 30s, which forcibly sterilized over 60,000 Americans deemed unfit to reproduce, drew explicitly on evolutionary ideas about improving the human race. The Nazi ideology that led to the Holocaust was steeped in perverted evolutionary thinking about racial hierarchies. Bryan saw this coming and tried to sound the alarm, but because he did it in the name of religion, he was dismissed as a backwards fool. And Darrow wasn't entirely wrong either. The Butler Act was a bad law, an attempt to use state power to enforce religious conformity. Evolution is real science, not a conspiracy to undermine faith. The Earth is billions of years old, not thousands. These are facts, and facts matter. A Christianity that requires believers to deny observable reality to maintain their faith is asking for trouble. Both sides had pieces of the truth. Both sides made mistakes. But instead of finding a way forward together, they divorced. And America's heartland lost something precious in that divorce. The sense that you could be deeply religious and fully modern, that faith and reason weren't enemies but partners in understanding truth. I want to leave you with one more story. In 1932, 7 years after the Scopes trial, a young man named Carl Henry enrolled at Wheaton College, the evangelical school that had positioned itself as an alternative to secular universities. Henry was a brilliant student, went on to get a PhD in philosophy from Boston University, became one of the most important evangelical theologians of the 20th century. He founded Christianity Today magazine, wrote extensively on how Christians should engage with modern culture, tried to build bridges between evangelical Christianity and mainstream intellectual life. In 1947, Henry published a book called The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism. In it, he argued that the fundamentalist retreat after Scopes had been a catastrophic mistake. By withdrawing from culture, by focusing solely on personal salvation and ignoring social issues, fundamentalists had abandoned the prophetic witness of 19th century evangelicals who'd fought slavery and championed the poor. Henry called for a new evangelical engagement with the world, intellectually sophisticated and culturally aware, but theologically conservative. His vision partly succeeded. The neo-evangelical movement he helped launch did re-engage with American culture. Billy Graham became a national figure. Evangelical colleges improved their academic standards. Christianity Today became a serious intellectual journal. But the basic segregation, the cultural divorce set in motion at Scopes, never fully healed. Even Carl Henry, for all his brilliance, remained primarily known within evangelical circles. The mainstream intellectual world still didn't really know what to do with a sophisticated conservative Christian.